Oh, we're about to get to that. Because yeah, they can have Uh, hey guys, can you hear me? Make
I think
sure
it's
I'm good
muted.
on. Yeah.
It's on mute.
No, it's not.
Oh.
Is it?
Oh no, it's good. You can-
Okay. Hey guys. So today we will be talking about cellular respiration, like I talked about on the announcement, and yeah. So we could start off by talking about. I was planning to start off by talking about just go through the cycle or to go through the process of going of cellular respiration. We can just talk about each step. There's a total of 4, and then later on we can talk about some mnemonic devices or some reactions that are really important throughout the steps. And then later on, once we're done with those, we can talk about fermentation, and then we can talk about the fate of pyruvates, what that means. And then lastly, we can talk about the differences between fermentations between us and E. coli or yeast. And then maybe if we get to that point, we can talk about photosynthesis. I don't think we'll get there today, but if we do get there, then we'll talk about it. But yeah, I guess we'll go right into it. If you have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat, and I'll get to them, even if it has nothing to do with this. Just give me 1 second. Sorry. All right. Let me know if there's any questions. Like even if I'm.
Definitely. Yes, sir.
Yeah, even if it was like in the middle of talking about something.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Oh man, that's my markers. All right. Let's see. Actually, let's talk about. All right. So, are you guys both signed on?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we can start off. I realize that maybe we should talk about the kind of reactions we're going to deal with when it comes to cellular respiration. Usually, or the more important ones, the type of reactions we're going to see a lot are called oxidation and reduction. Now, when we're talking about oxidation and reduction, there's 2 senses of the word, or 2 senses of how it's done, where you'll see it. There's inorganic. That's when you're talking about ions, or when you're talking about like copper ions and zinc ions, or just molecules by themselves. Organic, that's when you're talking about inside of a living organism, in the sense of glucose or organic materials that have carbon in them. Even though they might look different, they follow the same principle. So we'll go into depth for both of them, and then that way we can better understand the processes that are occurring in cellular respiration. So for starters, we're going to talk about inorganic because that's usually the easier one. So All right. So when we're talking about in inorganic sense, usually in the inorganic sense, like I mentioned before, we're talking about ions, and in this case, we're going to talk about, for a common example, would be sodium and chloride. So for this example, you have sodium uncharged and chloride uncharged, and when it undergoes an oxidation and reduction reaction, each one will go through a different one. And so for sodium, it's going to lose an electron, and so it's going to gain a negative charge. And for that, we call oxidation. However, the sodium is losing an electron and becoming positive, while the chlorine or the chlorine is going to gain an electron and therefore become negative. And so that's what we call reduction. So in that sense, a simple way to remember this, and I'm sure you know this from your chemistry classes, is oil rig. And so oil stands for oxidation is losing. And what is it losing? It's losing electrons in the inorganic sense. Now, oil rig, the second part, rig is reduction is gaining. So RIG. What is it gaining? It's gaining electrons. So a good way to remember which process is gaining or losing electrons is oil rig. Now, something you notice is that usually redox reactions or reduction usually redox reactions or reduction oxidation reactions, usually they'll come in pairs. So you'll have something being reduced and something being oxidized, because if something is losing an electron, then it can use that, and something is trying to gain an electron, then it can use that electron and become reduced by taking the electron that is being taken away from a different material or being oxidized. So, and that's in the inorganic sense, in the sense of talking about ions. And so now we can move on to the inorganic sense, which is the more important one, especially when we're going to talk about cellular respiration. But if you have any questions so far, put them in the comments. Let me know if I'm going off camera, because I feel like I might be. Is it 6? It's 2 hours. Am I good?
Yeah. Or your head's kind of.
Thanks.
Okay, a little more.
A little bit more what? This way?
Perfect.
All right, cool. So in the organic sense, that's when you're talking about carbon-based molecules. Like we ourselves are organic organisms because we're based on carbon. And so in the organic sense, we're also talking about molecules that are based on carbon. So in this sense, we're looking at C6H12O6. Hopefully you guys know that's glucose. Right? We're dealing with the reaction that's glucose plus oxygen is going to give us CO2, carbon dioxide, and H2O. Hopefully you guys know that this is the reaction of cellular respiration. So the way you can kind of think of it, cellular respiration, that's what we do. So we're breathing in oxygen. We're taking in glucose, right? We don't give out sugars. We take in sugars. And then we also take in oxygen. And what do we produce? When we breathe out, we produce CO2 and also water vapor. So that's cellular respiration. And so when we're talking about cellular respiration, we can also see oxidation and reduction occurring. So in the sense, for the case of, well, let me just write it. Yeah. Okay. So, what are we going to? Did I write that one? No, that's right. Okay. So, in the organic sense, we're going to talk about which one's being reduced and which one's being oxidized. And so, if you look at glucose, and that becomes CO2. So that one is going to be losing CH bonds, and it's going to be gaining CO bonds. And so that's how we determine this is an oxidation reaction. However, if you look at O2, in the beginning, O2 does not have any bonds to hydrogens, but it gains them. It gains bonds to hydrogen, and it becomes water, so H2O. And so that's what we call reduced. Now, let me write that down. Reduction. Oh, no. Is gaining CH bonds. Reduction. Losing. Now, oxidation is gaining CH bonds. Did I write that backwards? Yes, I did. Is losing. Gaining. Yes. So reduction is the case where you're gaining CO bonds or CH.
No, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because you just follow hydrogen. So
Yeah, but reduction is gaining of this.
CH ones. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think I had it right the first time. Maybe. I don't know. So oxidation is losing. See.
I think it could be CH, yeah.
Wait, no, I think they're both gaining. They're both gaining. They're gaining CO bonds, losing CH bonds.
Yeah.
Oh man. I think I might be going on screen.
Yeah.
Losing. Okay. Now that we got that mess out of the way. Okay. I think I went too far. There you go. So. So when we look at oxidation in the cellular respiration, we're looking at glucose. It's becoming CO2, and in that sense, it's losing CH bonds when it's going from C6H12O6 to CO2. It's losing H bonds. Or another way you can classify oxidation is by it gaining CO bonds. And so the way reduction is determined in organic sense is that it's gaining CH bonds. And you can see that when you're looking at the O2. O2 is gaining CH bonds, and that's why you see it come H2O. Another way you can think of it is it losing CO bonds. Let's see what else. Yeah. So now, at first glance, these might look very, very different from each other, but as you'll figure out later in upper division biology or biochemistry, is that if you're looking at oxidation, I'm going to give you a second to take this all in, and then put any questions in the comments if you have any. I'll give you a minute, and also be sure to check the links to sign in. But yeah, I'll give you a minute just in case any of you guys have any questions. Oh, just kidding. Did I unmute it? Cool. So, what I was trying to get at is that I have to erase this real quick, and then I'll show you a picture. Is that too small?
Do you have another marker?
Yeah, the red one does not like.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, black and red.
Nice. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's see how this one.
Oh my gosh, bro.
How embarrassing!
I'm so excited. I didn't mean to set you up like that in front of live
you're
television.
Oh no! People are gonna make gifs of that. Is that how you say it?
They're gonna make gifs of that. But you said just.
GIF.
Oh,
GIFs?
GIFs? I don't.
GIFs?
I've never said that. Oh, you mean that?
Type in the comments what you guys think. Is it GIFs or GIFs? All right. So, when we're talking about in the organic sense, you can remember we base it off of CH bonds and CO bonds. And so, if you guys remember, I mean, we just talked about it like 20 seconds ago. When you're losing CH bonds and gaining CO bonds, that is called oxidation. But when you're gaining or you're losing CO bonds and gaining CH bonds, that is called reduction in the organic sense. Yeah, you can read that right. Yeah. Reduction. I think I made it worse. In this sense, in this reaction, this carbon molecule is losing its bond to CO and it's gaining a bond to H, right? Now, remember, this is like unit 1 material, but you gotta, if you're trying to connect the two, the organic sense, and the organic redox reactions and the inorganic, the way you can kind of think of it is that, think about electronegativity. So for this carbon, right, instead of the electrons being directly halfway, you can't see that. Instead of it being halfway between the CO, between the C and the O, the electrons are going to be more closer. It's going to be closer to the oxygen. Why? Well, if you guys remember, O is more electronegative than carbon, and so those electrons are going to be pulled more closer to the oxygen. Now, let's say the carbon, for some reason, it loses that CO bond and it gains the CH bond, and that's why we see here. So what happens is, which one's more electronegative now? Is it carbon or hydrogen? Well, carbon's a little bit more electronegative than hydrogen, and so you'll see that electrons come a little bit more closer to carbon. And so that going from a carbon, so in this case right here, right, this carbon is not close to the electrons, but now it switched that bond to a hydrogen bond, and now the electrons are closer to carbon. So in a sense, it's gaining electrons. What did we say gaining of electrons was in the inorganic sense? Well, that was what we called reduction. And so you see this thing with oxidation. Before, when it has a CH bond closer to carbon, but when it goes and you switch that bond to a CO bond, it's going to be farther away. So in a sense, this carbon is losing those electrons. And that's what we call oil, and this is what we call rig. And so if you still want to talk about oil rig, because it's such a good mnemonic device for the inorganic chemistry, when you're talking about in the organic chemistry, you can still use oil rig, but you got to remember which one is gaining and which one's losing electrons. If this is too weird for you, you can just memorize reduction is gaining of CH bonds, and oxidation is gaining of CO bonds. If that's easier for you guys to remember, that's fine. This is a little bit more biochemistry, but it's also kind of cool to know. So now we can talk about, now that we talked about redox reactions, we can talk about cellular respiration. And if you guys have any questions about this at all, make sure to post comments in the comment section. That's not gonna go off.
Where is it?
Chemical. All right, so the first process or the first step of cellular respiration, that's going to be glycolysis. And so I wish I could spell. So when you're looking at glycolysis, you can break it down into two parts, like we usually do with words, and it tells you what's going on. So glyco, that will refer to the glucose that you're breaking down or breaking open, that's lysis, and so breaking of glycogen, breaking of glucose. And so glycolysis is the breaking down of glucose, and that's why that's the first step for cellular respiration. Because if you guys remember the formula, you start off with glucose. So we start off with glucose. So we start off with the molecule glucose, right? You take in glucose, whether, through foods or, through foods, obviously. You take in glucose and you're going to convert that into energy. Well, the first step is the first process of that, the whole mechanism is to break down that glucose first. So the first step is going from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Do you have the steps for you? So, yeah, I guess I'll draw it out. But I feel like if you don't draw it out, then it's not as informative. Up, down, up, down. Let's say this is alpha. So this is glucose. I didn't include all the hydrogens because that's boring. It takes too much. It gets really messy. But for every point of this triangle, or for every point of this hexagon, every point of this hexagon is going to have a hydrogen. And so, fill in the blanks if you really want to draw all the hydrogens. But we're going to start off with the glucose molecule. And the first step is we're going to convert that molecule into So the first step is converting this molecule of glucose from glucose to G6P or glucose 6-phosphate. Now you might be wondering where that name came from. Well, one, you need to know how to number your carbons. And so the best way to know how to number carbons, if you don't know already, is to start, or the way we do it is by starting where the carbon has the most oxygens attached. And so if you look at this first molecule right here, the place where the carbon that has the most oxygens attached to it is going to be this one right here. Why? Well, on this side it has an oxygen, and then it's also connected to a hydroxyl group. What about this one? This one is only connected to one oxygen, because on both sides it's connected to carbons. This one is also the same thing, carbon on both sides and just one connected to hydrogen or oxygen, and then the other one's connected to hydrogen, but I didn't draw. Same thing, same thing, same thing. The only one that's connected to the most or two oxygens is this carbon right here, and so that's why we label that one C1. And now we go clockwise. And so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so that 6 carbon right here, that's where this phosphate group is going to come in. That's where the phosphate group is going to come in, but the phosphate group has to come from somewhere. Well, where does that come from? Well, it comes from using one of the ATPs, or using one ATP. And so we go from ATP to ADP. And if you don't know already, ATP is adenosine triphosphate. And so it's a molecule that has 3 phosphate groups. And once we kick one of those out, it becomes di, or adenosine diphosphate. Well, what does that one phosphate group that we kicked out go? Well, that goes to the 6 carbon. Now, I'm not going to draw out all the hydroxyl groups. They're still there. Don't worry. I'm just going to draw the basic ring structure and maybe the oxygen. And if it becomes important, I'll draw it all out again. So that's the first step. Now, this is what we call an energy investment phase. And, similar to investments in like Wall Street or investments in your future or whatever, that's when you put something into, let's say, an account, or in this case, a molecule. So you can reap the benefits later, and you'll see that we'll get benefits from this later on. But basically, the investment is that we're using one ATP molecule in this step. So the next step. Oh, also, this step is very important, not just because it's the first step, but also because Dr. Latham, this is like an exam question right here. For this one, I totally forgot. Let's not move on yet. So for this step, we're going through this reaction, right? And we're adding a phosphate group, and we're converting glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. What I forgot to add was that there's an enzyme involved. It's usually abbreviated HK, right?
Hexokinase.
Yeah. Can you read that down there?
Check.
Yeah. Okay. Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So what I forgot to mention is that this process is like every other process in this whole 10 steps of glycolysis. It's going to be aided with an enzyme, which makes sense because you're using an adenosine phosphate group, or using an ATP molecule. You're working with substrates, and so this is going to be through a process called substrate level phosphorylation. So it's a big word, but it doesn't mean it's not that bad. And so basically what happens is that for this step right here, you're going to get a glucose molecule come into one side of this enzyme, and you're going to get an ATP, or adenosine phosphate, adenosine triphosphate. They're both going to come into this molecule, enzyme called hexokinase. Now, what you can remember what hexokinase is that hexo is 6, and kinase, well, you guys should know what that is already. We've seen it a lot. Kinase, or actually no, because a lot of you missed that question on the exam. So kinase, ACE is just a suffix. a suffix that we use to distinguish a molecule or a certain protein as an enzyme. Kine, kine, you can kind of think of it as kinetic energy. In the terms of this class, usually when a molecule is given a phosphate group, it becomes activated. Now, when you get to higher levels of biochemistry and organic chemistry and all that stuff, you'll see that not everything is activated, but in terms of this class, it's activated. So the way you can think of it is that kinetic energy enzyme is an enzyme. Did I spell that wrong? I did spell it wrong. So the way you can think of it is that it's an enzyme. It's an enzyme that gives kinetic energy to molecules that are six members or six have six carbons. Let's say that. So what molecule do we know that has six carbons? Well, that's glucose. So an enzyme that gives kinetic energy, how does it give kinetic energy? It gives you a lollipop or a phosphate group. Lollipop. I don't know. It gives you a lollipop, or in this case, a phosphate group. Gives you kinetic energy because you get more excited when you're giving candy. And so that's a good way to remember it, hexokinase. So now when we're looking at hexokinase, let's talk about what it does. An enzyme, usually what it does, it allows for this molecule to more easily convert into the next molecule. And so what this hexokinase is going to do for this enzyme or for this molecule is that it's going to bend this ATP group. It's going to bend it in a way that it can easily take off a phosphate and then add it to the glucose. And once that's added to it, what leaves the enzyme is a G6P. What leaves the enzyme, hexokinase, is G6P, which is what this is, and ADP, because we used the molecule of phosphate to include it in the glucose. Every one of these steps is going to have an enzyme. Every one of these steps is going to have two molecules on either side. The only ones that you have to really, really know, and that's why I wanted to come back and talk about this, is that steps 1, which is this, step 1. Step 1 is very important because 1, it's the first step, obviously, and also it's usually tested. So make sure you know, Dr. Latham wants you to know the molecule names. So this one is glucose. This one's glucose 6-phosphate or G6P. You need to know the enzyme, HK or hexokinase, and you need to know, that's about it. Maybe obviously you need to know that ATP is used in this step. And the next steps that we need to know is step 3, and then later on step 7 and 10, I believe. Or is it step 10, 7 and 10, or is it 5 and 10? Oh, this one? That's step 10, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's step 5 and 10. Right? I don't know. I think it is step 5 and 10. But now we're just going to go through it a little bit faster. Now that we went through this one pretty in depth, we're going to talk about step 2. Oh, last thing, substrate level phosphorylation. That was because there was an enzyme involved, and it worked directly with the substrate to phosphorylate it. Later on, we'll look at a different way of phosphorylation that's called oxidative phosphorylation, and you'll see why they're very different from each other. Let's keep on going. Step 2. Now, we are working still. So now we're going to work with, we're going to be working with a, what's going on right there? So in this case, we're going to be working with G6P because that was what we got out of step 2. And so now we're going to work, this is going to be, or out of step 1, we got G6P, and now we're working with a new molecule, or we're going to convert it into a new molecule. This right here is fructose, 6P. F6P. All right. Yes, I am right. Yes. So I'm going to be working with, I'm going to be changing glucose into fructose. And so I'm working with G6P because that was what I got from step 1. And now I'm converting it into fructose 6-phosphate. Now I'm using this conversion to, you'll see later on, it's going to become very important later on. So this enzyme right here that you don't need to know in this case, not like you needed to know for step 1, is called phosphofructose kinase, or PFK. Now, this enzyme is really easy to remember. Phosphofructo, phospho, you can think of phosphate. Fructose is the molecule you're trying to convert glucose into. And kinase, well, it's the one that works with, instead of giving it a phosphate group, this one's going to be, oh no. Sorry, I skipped a step. Not phosphofructose kinase. Phosphofructose. Summaries. I skipped a step.
I think that's phosphoglucose.
Thank you. Yeah. So the same thing applies. Phospho, as in like phosphate group, gluco, because you're working with the molecule that you're going to convert, which is glucose, and isomerase, because fructose and glucose are isomerases or isomers of each other. And so this enzyme creates an isomer of a phosphorylated glucose. And that's what this is. And so the enzyme basically tells you what you're working with to convert it into the next step. In this step, as you guys can see, there's no addition of of phosphate groups. And so there's no use of use of ATPs in this step. And so that's all you need to know. You just need to know step 2 is G6P to F6P. There was just a change in ring structure. That's all. Remember, step 1 and 3, those are the ones you have to memorize everything about. These, just know what's going on for this step. Now let's talk about step 3, which you do need to memorize, and which I was very eager to get to. So, let me. Goes 1,6,5-phosphate. FEP. I forgot. Does the book abbreviate it 1,6 phosphate BP, or does it just say FBP?
We said this.
How does it abbreviate it?
So you agree the control.
No, they don't. Yeah. Oh, okay. That's weird. Usually they abbreviate stuff, but I'm just gonna say FBP. So, so step 3. This is another step that you have to memorize, according that Dr. Lickham wants you to memorize. So, because of step 2, we just finished step 2. Now we're going into step 3 of glycolysis. That's you just finished with F6P. That's what you got out of step 6. Fructose 6-phosphate. Now, the enzyme that's going to use this molecule and convert it to something else is phosphofructokinase. So PFK. Phosphofructokinase, remember, kinase is an enzyme that gives energy, or gives a phosphate group to a phosphorylated fructose. And so that's what this is, right? This is a phosphorylated fructose molecule. It's going to give it a phosphate group, and it's going to become fructose 1,6-phosphate. And so because it goes from having one molecule of phosphate to having 2, it becomes bisphosphate. Bisphosphate. There's an S. Bisphosphate. And so we abbreviate that FBP. Now it's going to have molecules on, remember, 1, 6. It's going to add a molecule to the first carbon of this fructose 6-phosphate, and so that's going to become fructobisphosphate. It's going to have one molecule on the 6 and one molecule on the first carbon. I messed that up. No, there's also one right here. Yeah. You're going to add a phosphate group to that side, and now you can kind of see that there's a symmetry going on between this molecule, right? There's 2 phosphate groups, one on each side, which is important for the next step. But yeah, this step is one of the steps that you have to memorize. You have to know the enzyme, which is PFK. You need to know the starting molecule, the starting molecule or reactant, the product, and you need to know that this is an energy investment phase because we're investing one ATP molecule. Yeah. If you have any questions, make sure to post them in the comments. Let's see what else. So step 4. We're going to be working with that very symmetrical molecule that I hinted at. Just going to draw it up right up. I need to see this because I told you how to write that. Let's see. How do you draw this again? All right. So we can talk about step 4 and 5 together. So let's work our way through it. So remember, we start off from the product of step 4 step 3 is going to become the reactant of step 4. So this is going to be FBP. FBP, like I hinted at before, it's very symmetrical, and so that allows us to cut right down the middle of this molecule right here. We can just cut right in between. Now, because there's not the perfect symmetry between it, as you guys can tell, there's only one oxygen on this side, and so there's not an oxygen on this side, and so it's not perfectly symmetrical, but it does look symmetrical. So if we cut down the middle, even though it looks symmetrical because of the two phosphate groups, the way you can kind of remember that you're not going to get the same product is because that oxygen, you can't split that oxygen in half, and so you're going to get two different molecules. One is going to be called DHP, or dihydroxyl. You know the name of it? Dihydroxyl something.
Dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Dihydroxyacetone. I guess you're right.
Dihydroxy. That's a weird one. Yeah, dihydroxyacetone phosphate. DHAP. My bad. Acetone phosphate. Yeah, and so that's the molecule that you get here. The other molecule that you get is G3P. Now, notice that both of them have a phosphate group because we were able to split that, but they're not exactly the same molecule. One of them is G3P, which is glucose 3-phosphate. The other one is DHAP. Now, we can talk about this step together with step 5 because step 5 is simply the conversion of one of them into the other one. Now, I drew this kind of weird looking double-sided arrow because, one, I want to signify that because these two molecules are made in the same amount, they can convert from each other back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But because when it comes to glycolysis, you're trying to create energy, one of these molecules is going to be favored more than the other. And so looking at this arrow, you can see that more of these DHAP molecules are going to be more likely to be converted to G3P rather than G3P converted to DHP. And that's what you kind of see with this little arrow compared to this big arrow going from the top to the bottom, and the little, like, not that much going from G3P to DHP. And the reason why is because step 6 is going to use this molecule more. You can go into the concentration dynamics of it. Like this one is going to be used out more, and so the molecule is going to favor creating this one more. That's more chemistry than biology, but just know that this is the molecule that you want to go with. So even though you create both of them, this one in step 5 is going to be more likely to change into G3P. And that molecule, that enzyme that allows this process to occur, is an isomerase because one, these molecules are isomers of each other, and so you just need an enzyme to help it go from one isomer to the other, isomerase. For this one, it's going to be called aldolase. Oh, I remember what I used to say for this one. Okay, stick with me. So aldolase, ACE, obviously that's an enzyme. Aldo, you might be thinking that's a weird one. What can you think of that? Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's a very popular shoe store called Aldo. Now, that might sound weird, but there's a shoe store called Aldo. It's a thing. Look it up. Now, when you go try on shoes, right? When you're given both the shoes, you're not given both with the laces, right? One of them has the laces on, that way you can try it on. The other one doesn't have laces on. Well, one of them doesn't have laces on. The other one does. Which one are you going to try on? Which one is the one you're going to probably like more? Well, the one with the laces on. So that's a kind of way you can kind of remember this. If that's too complicated, don't worry about it. But later on in biochemistry, when you have to memorize each step, that could be really useful to know these kind of silly mnemonic devices. So aldolase, you're going to create two molecules that are kind of the same, right? They're almost the same shoes. One of them though does not have shoelaces. The other one does. So you're going to eventually want to put shoelaces on this one to create this one. And so yeah, aldolase. Now we can move on to the next steps. Now, however, this step 5, this hallmarks the end of a phase that we call the energy investment phase. So I'm going to erase this. Is that right? Yeah. So energy payout. Yeah. So steps 1 through 5, that's going to be your energy investment phase, like we saw with steps 1 and 3. The energy investment phase. Investment phase. 1, 2, 3. So energy investment phase, it's going to categorize steps 1 through 5 as a phase where you invest energy, where you're putting energy into the process of glycolysis. Energy is going to be taken out of this process, or going to be being paid. It's going to be a payoff in steps 6 through 10, namely 7 and 10 are the steps where you're going to get energy. Now, it's no coincidence that steps 1 and 3 and 7 and 10, those are the steps that Dr. Latham wants you to memorize, because those are very important. They deal with the energy consumption or payoff. So just know that. So now let's move on to step 6. We just finished with G3P. That was the product. G3P. How do you draw that again? How do you draw G3P? There. You can write that to line. And this phosphate is, that's right. BGP, BPG. This phosphate. This right. So that is I put one too many. So, what did I do? Wait. Let me do deep try.
Trios. Trios, what's the dehydrogenase?
So, an important thing that we have to remember is that from step 6 and forward, we're actually right at the end of step 5. We're working with 2 molecules, right? And so in the beginning of step 6, we're working with 2 G3P, not just one. And so that affects the rest of the process. So we start off with 2 of these molecules, G3P. We work with the enzyme triose phosphate glycerate. Triose phosphate dehydrogenase. So it's a weird name. It's a long one. So it's a good thing you don't have to memorize this one because that's an ugly name. But basically, this reaction is an oxidation reduction reaction. And so when you see dehydrogenase, that's when you're talking about redox reactions. And so in this one, you can tell it's a redox reaction because of what's going to be being used or what's involved. So if you guys look at this right here, you see that there's NAD plus being used. 2 molecules of NAD plus, and it's being converted to NADH. And so it's gaining an H bond. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that it's being reduced. And however, for this one right here, for this G3P, it's being converted to 1,3-bisphosphate glycerate. When you add that, wait, no, is that right? So I just took a well-deserved break, but we're going to quickly just go through, instead of going through each step, we're going to focus on the next 2 steps that are very, very important, 7 and 10. So 7, we're on step what are we on? 6. So this will feed right into the next step. So let's move on to step 7. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh. So working with PGK. We get 2 of these, and we get 2 of these. Yeah, this is 3 PG. Yeah, so we're going from BPG. We're working with 2 molecules of BPG. We're going to convert it into 3PG, 2 molecules of 3PG. Now, as you guys can tell, we go from bisphosphate to phosphate, right? We lose that B because we're losing one of these phosphate groups. Where does that phosphate group go? Well, we can add it to the ADP molecule right here and convert it to ATP. Now, this is one of the steps that produces energy. And the important thing is that we're working with 2 molecules of BPG. And so this reaction goes twice. We take off one phosphate group from one and create an ATP. Then we use the other molecule of BPG, take one of its phosphates away and put it into the ATP. And so that way, in this step, we create 2 ATP molecules. And we're left with 3PG, 2 molecules of 3PG. The enzyme is going to be called phosphoglycerol-kinase. And yeah, all right, so let's move on to step 10, because the next important step. We're actually step 10. Yeah. So step 8, we're going to use that 3PG, those 2 molecules of 3PG. We're going to convert that into 2-phosphoglycerate. Not much to say about that molecule. You're just converting it. You're just kind of mutating that molecule, and that's why the enzyme right there is called phosphoglycer. Oh man, I can't talk. Glyceromatase. Now we're going to go from the phosphoglycerate through step 9. We're going to convert phosphoglycerate into a new molecule called PEP, which is really important because that's going to be, which is pyro. Is it pyro? No, that's the last one. Federal phosphor. I'm so tired.
I was like, what are you reading? Phosphoenol
Yes.
pyruvate.
Phosphoenol
Enol pyruvate.
pyruvate.
Almost there, bro.
Thank you. I'm so tired. All right, so let's see. Okay, so we go from phosphoglycerate to PEP or phosphoenol pyruvate. That's where you get the name PEP. Two molecules of that. Now, the enol in this name, that will give you a hint at what kind of enzyme we're going to use. We're going to use enolase, which is an enzyme that creates an enol, or in this case, phosphoenol pyruvate. Not much to know about that step. The big important step is step 10, which is a step you have to memorize, and you have to know very well in detail. Where you start off with 2EP. You start off with two molecules of PEP, and you create two molecules of ATP. So you create two molecules of pyruvate, and so PEP, that's drawn as something like this. So as you guys can see, we take away this phosphate group and we give it to an ADP molecule, creating ATP. And because we have two of these molecules, we can do that twice. And so that's why we go from 2 PEP. We start off with 2 PEP and 2 ADPs, and we convert it into, we convert PEP to pyruvate. And that phosphate group from PEP goes into ATP, therefore creating two molecules of ATP. And that's a very important step. And the enzyme is pyruvate, because that's the product. Pyruvate. What am I saying? Yeah, pyruvate kinase. Yeah. So you're going to work with the molecule. You're going to work with the enzyme pyruvate kinase, which is usually abbreviated as PK. Pyruvate being the molecule that you're working with, and it's dealing with the taking away of phosphates or giving the phosphate group. In this case, you're taking the phosphate group from the substrate and you're giving it to the ADP molecule. So in this case, it's kind of the opposite of what we saw in the step 1 and 3, where you're taking a molecule and you're taking ATP and you're taking the phosphate group from the energy of ATP to the molecule. But in this case, you're taking the phosphate group from the molecule and giving it to ADP. But yeah, very important steps. And now we're going to go into fermentation. And then that'll be the last thing we talk about.